Welcome to The Critical Edge, the no-nonsense podcast breaking down the latest game-changing evidence in trauma and surgical critical care to give you the edge when things get critical.
It's great to be here.
And welcome to today's deep dive. I was thinking about this. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis or, a surgical pathway, there is this comforting expectation of absolute precision.
Oh, absolutely. It feels almost like engineering sometimes.
Right. You get a blunt force trauma patient rolled in, the fast exam, that focused assessment with sonography for trauma, it just lights up with fluid in Morrison's pouch.
Yeah, and the hemodynamics are tanking.
Exactly. And you just point and say, to the OR for an exploratory laparotomy.
It's very binary. It's an algorithm, right?
Yeah.
Hemoperitoneum or no hemoperitoneum.
It's clean. And honestly, it is incredibly comforting to have that clarity because as surgeons, we like things to be visible.
We want them categorized.
Yeah, categorized within the four walls of our perfectly lit, temperature-controlled, fully stocked trauma bays. We want the blood bank a phone call away.
And we want the massive transfusion protocol running like absolute clockwork.
But then you step into the world of battlefield trauma systems, and suddenly that pristine algorithmic machine is just completely shattered.
It is entirely blown apart.
Yeah.
Because you're looking at a logistical, environmental, and diagnostic landscape that is, frankly, exceptionally murky.
Totally.
I mean, you are operating in the dirt, in pitch blackness.
Under active hostile fire.
Right, under fire with severely limited blood products and maybe a single medic holding a flashlight for you.
And that extreme contrast is exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. Our mission for you, the attending trauma surgeon listening, or the surgical critical care fellow, the clinician just striving for optimal patient outcomes in a civilian setting, is to really unpack this.
We need to look at the comprehensive evolution of these systems.
Yeah, the current rigid structure and the future integration of these battlefield trauma systems with your daily practice.
And to accomplish this, we're analyzing a definitive, really comprehensive chapter titled Trauma Systems on the Battlefield.
Right.
Our objective here is to extract the high-yield clinical pearls, understand these massive organizational frameworks like the Joint Trauma System, and explore the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's urgent push for zero preventable deaths.
Now, you might be sitting in a level-I trauma center in a major U.S. city right now, listening to this and thinking, look, I'm not dodging shrapnel, right? I treat high-speed motor vehicle collisions.
I treat civilian penetrating trauma.
Exactly. Why does the military's logistical framework matter to my daily clinical practice?
Well, it matters because the stakes couldn't be higher for your civilian practice.
Period.
Every single major military advancement in damage control, resuscitation, hemorrhage control, and system organization directly dictates the future of the guidelines you follow every day.
Yeah, I mean, the American College of Surgeons, ACE.
Their guidelines in your civilian trauma bay are literally written in the ink of military data.
That's such a good point. The shift to whole blood, the deployment of Rebo-A, these didn't originate in some pristine civilian lab.
No, they were forged, tested, and proven in the operational theaters of the last 2 decades.
So to really understand how we arrived at modern damage control surgery and our current guidelines, we kind of have to trace the historical arc.
We do. We have to look at the monumental shift from just treating an isolated, devastating wound to managing an entire complex continuum of care.
And the text starts by taking us way back into the antiquity of trauma. I mean, we are talking about the Edwin Smith papyrus from the ancient Egyptians.
Which is arguably the first documented surgical text we have.
Yeah, and what stands out when you review that historical timeline is just the sheer magnitude of clinical stagnation.
For centuries, for millennia, really.
Yeah.
Military medicine was strictly about the wound itself.
With zero concept of a system.
None. You had the Greeks, with Hippocrates in the 4th and 5th centuries BC, teaching that wound separation.
Wait, like the actual formation of pus?
Yes, the actual formation of pus. They taught that it was a necessary and positive key to healing.
Oh, wow. They called it laudable pus, right?
Exactly. Laudable pus.
Which, from our modern surgical critical care perspective, is just a complete sepsis nightmare.
It's terrifying.
The idea that you would actively encourage an infection because you misunderstand the body's inflammatory response so badly.
It is. But that was the absolute dogma. Then, you move into the Roman Empire, and Galen, from 130 to 200 AD, introduces some truly novel surgical technique.
Right, he's suturing intestines.
He's trepanning the skull to relieve intracranial pressure from epidural hematomas.
Yeah.
So we see these flashes of brilliant surgical technique.
And in the Middle Ages, you have French surgeons like Henri de Mondeville dedicating their lives to complex wound treatment,
And Ambroise Paré, who famously ran out of boiling oil.
which is a horrific standard for cauterizing amputations.
And very horrific. But he ran out and was forced to use a soothing salve of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine.
And he found his patients actually survived the night without agonizing pain and systemic shock.
Right. Plus, Jean-Louis Petit inventing the screw tourniquet. I mean, these are monumental leaps in surgical technique for the individual patient.
They are. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, something vital is missing here.
The entire system around the surgeon is missing.
Yeah, you have these brilliant individual practitioners performing absolute heroics on the table, but the patient has still been lying in a muddy ditch for 3 days, bleeding out before they ever reach that table.
Because there is no transport. There is no triage.
Precisely. The care focused entirely on the individual casualty. There was absolutely zero systemic foundation.
And it wasn't until the burgeoning United States entered the Revolutionary War in 1775 that the catastrophic failure of this non-system became undeniable.
Yeah, casualties were just scattered across the countryside.
In private homes, barns, being treated by well-meaning citizens with wildly varying levels of competence and supplies.
It was an absolute logistical disaster, so to address it, the Second Continental Congress forms the Hospital Department of the Army.
And they appoint John Morgan as the director.
Right. And he tries to organize a system by centralizing care to general hospitals. But the text notes that while he succeeded conceptually, the execution failed miserably.
Because of a massive lack of resources.
Centralizing patients just doesn't work if you don't have the wagons to move them.
Or the bandages to wrap them, or the trained surgeons to receive them.
Exactly. Which brings us to a critical inflection point in the text. The birth of formal triage and transport at the turn of the 19th century.
During the Napoleonic Wars, Dominique Jean Larrey invents the flying ambulance.
Now, before Larry, casualties were strictly treated at the end of the battle, right?
Yes. The military dogma was that moving wounded soldiers during the fight would demoralize the ranks.
And block the ammunition carts. So if you survived the initial bleeding, maybe you saw a surgeon a day later.
But Larry pushed care aggressively forward into the battle space. And more importantly, he developed the first rank-agnostic triage system.
Meaning treating patients based on the physiological extent of their injury instead of their military rank.
Right. It's wild to think that before Larry, a general with a sprained ankle might command the attention of the lead surgeon before a private with a severed femoral artery.
That's just crazy to think about.
It completely upended the paradigm. He recognized that time to intervention was the actual determinant of survival.
And this evolution continued into the U.S. Civil War. Jonathan Letterman, who is rightfully called the father of modern battlefield medicine, he developed a formal Army ambulance corps.
He didn't just build wagons, though. He mandated strict hospital sanitation protocols.
He required the formal credentialing of surgeons to weed out the charlatans, too.
And he normalized the use of anesthesia. He instituted a triage and transport system so that casualties were moved expeditiously.
So we're slowly building the necessary pieces. We have transport vehicles, we have triage based on acuity, credentialed surgeons.
But the text states that from a true trauma system standpoint, it wasn't until World War I that a comprehensively integrated system emerged.
Driven by a Russian surgeon, Vladimir Opel.
Yes, Opel is a foundational figure for what you and our listeners practice today. He witnessed the horrific, unacceptable morbidity of trench warfare.
High-velocity projectiles, artillery shells causing massive tissue destruction.
Combined with the highly infectious environment of the mud and the trenches, he realized that loading these patients onto slow transport to a rear hospital was a guaranteed death sentence.
Because their physiological reserve would simply run out.
Exactly. So he coined a concept that is still the bedrock of trauma surgery. The right operation for the right patient at the right location at the right time.
Which is the holy grail. It means you don't do a complex 6-hour bowel reconstruction in a muddy trench.
You do a 5-minute damage control laparotomy to stop the bleeding, pack the abdomen, and ship them.
Opel essentially established the first echelons of care. He built a system centered on moving surgical capability closer to the point of injury rather than moving the injured patient to the surgery.
And this echelon system was then cultivated and expanded going into World War II.
And WWII was highly kinetic and incredibly mobile compared to the static trenches of WWI.
So the push to move surgical care forward became even more substantial. We see the development of auxiliary surgical groups.
These highly mobile units bringing the OR right to the front lines.
We see the beginnings of transcontinental aeromedical evacuation, and then the Korean War introduces rapid helicopter evacuation.
To bypass the impossible rocky terrain. And that's when we see the formal establishment of MAS units, right? The Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals.
Yes, and this rapid iteration of vertical evacuation and forward surgery blossoms even further in the Vietnam War. Helicopter evacuation becomes the absolute standard.
Drastically reducing the time from injury to definitive surgical intervention.
But Vietnam also brought us a highly critical piece of the modern trauma puzzle that was previously missing: longitudinal data tracking.
Oh, Major Norman Rich?
Yes, then Major Norman Rich, an Army vascular surgeon. He created a specialized registry for all of his vascular injury patients to provide long-term follow-up.
The Vietnam Vascular Registry. It was the first of its kind for rigorous trauma research. The text actually has this great picture of him, Colonel Rich, in front of a medical museum he built in Vietnam.
Holding what looks like a spear, right?
Yeah, with grenades and shrapnel mounted on the wall behind him. He recognized early on that you simply cannot improve a system if you are not measuring the outcomes of your interventions.
And though his specific registry was relatively short-lived after the conflict, those hard lessons laid the crucial groundwork.
For what would eventually become tactical combat casualty pair, critical care air transport teams, and dedicated data collection.
Exactly.
But looking at this entire historical arc, early battlefield medicine feels like building a state-of-the-art trauma bay directly on top of quicksand.
That's a great analogy.
Right. You had these brilliant individual practitioners, Galen, Perret, Letterman, Opal, Rich. They were erecting these incredible load-bearing pillars of medical innovation.
But because there was zero permanent systemic foundation to sustain their work long-term, the quicksand just swallowed it up the moment the war ended.
Yes. Every major conflict seemed to force a rapid, desperate period of medical innovation that was promptly forgotten during peacetime.
Institutional amnesia.
Exactly. So my pushback here is, how did the military finally break that devastating cycle?
That is the pivotal question of this entire text.
Yeah.
How do you stop relearning the exact same bloody lessons every single generation?
Yay.
The answer was the intentional creation of the 21st Century Joint Trauma System, or the JTS. It was explicitly designed to be a living, breathing organism.
A permanent bridge between conflict-driven innovation and continuous peacetime performance improvement.
Because for a long time, the civilian sector was actually vastly outpacing the military between wars.
Yeah, significantly. In the decades following WWII, Korea, and Vietnam, the incredible military advancements were actually absorbed and perfected by the civilian sector.
The U.S. implemented formal regional trauma networks.
Rigorous trauma education like the Advanced Trauma Life Support course.
And the American College of Surgeons verification networks thrived.
So the military leadership recognized this peacetime success and realized they desperately needed to harness that civilian organizational model and bring it back to the battlefield.
They needed a continuous civilian-to-military feedback loop.
Precisely. So early initiatives during the global war on terror included establishing a dedicated theater trauma registry in 2003.
And initiating a formal trauma system consultation for the Operation Iraqi Freedom Theater. This directly led to the creation of the Joint Theater Trauma System, the JTTS, in 2004.
They deployed a medical director and a specialized team directly to the combat zone.
And they didn't just observe. They started developing and enforcing clinical practice guidelines based on real-world experience and actual real-time registry data abstraction.
And what's crucial here is that this wasn't just another temporary task force destined to be disbanded.
No, the text highlights a monumental shift in military medical doctrine. The contingency-based JTTS matured and was formally established as an enduring permanent joint trauma system in 2011.
And then it was actually legislated into survival.
Yes. The 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, an actual U.S. law passed by Congress, directed the formal establishment of the JTS within the Defense Health Agency, the DHA.
That legislation cannot be overstated. It legally mandated that the JTS serve as the definitive reference body for all trauma care across the entire military health system.
It gave them the absolute authority to establish clinical standards of care.
to coordinate the rapid translation of research into those standards and rigorously incorporate lessons learned into daily clinical practice.
And to figure out how to do this across a global enterprise, they conducted a massive organizational assessment that resulted in over 200 proposed distinct solutions.
200 solutions. That is a staggering amount of administrative and logistical heavy lifting. How is the DHA actually structured now to handle that kind of volume and complexity?
Well, the JTS was strategically organized within the DHA into 6 highly functional branches. These are vital for our civilian listeners to understand as they heavily mirror and interact with your own civilian structures.
Right.
You have the DoD Trauma Registry, Performance Improvement, Combatant Command Trauma Systems, the Defense Committee on Trauma, Joint Trauma Education and Training, and Data Analysis.
And just to clarify for the listener, the Defense Committee on Trauma is essentially the military's direct equivalent of the ACS Committee on Trauma, right?
Exactly. Functioning to ensure standardized, high-quality care across every single facility.
Furthermore, they establish a highly detailed procedural instruction defining the exact roles and responsibilities for establishing a trauma system in each of the U.S. military's 6 worldwide geographic combatant commands.
They detailed 11 specific operational capabilities and 12 core clinical functions that are required uniformly during both peace and war.
And if we look at those 11 capabilities, it paints a picture of a massive continuum. You have the leadership cell, prevention of injury programs, pre-hospital trauma care.
Point of injury evacuation.
Then it scales up to advanced resuscitative care, forward damage control surgery, interfacility transfer platforms, definitive surgical reconstruction,
In-theater rehabilitation.
long-range strategic evacuation, and finally, con-use hospitalization, meaning stateside and VA long-term follow-up.
And those 12 core functions include incredibly rigid field triage protocols. For example, explicitly assessing the patient's Glasgow Coma Scale, their systolic blood pressure, and their respiratory rate at the point of injury.
If those specific physiological markers are abnormal, the protocol absolutely dictates immediate transport to a designated trauma center.
It evaluates exact mechanisms of injury and specific anatomical derangements. It completely removes the guesswork for the provider under fire.
You know, visualizing this entire JTS structure, it acts exactly like a central nervous system for trauma.
I like that.
The DoD Trauma Registry is the sensory input, right? Gathering raw data from the furthest, most austere fingertips of the battlefield. The data analysis branch acts as the brain, processing that input to find patterns of mortality.
And the clinical practice guidelines are the motor response.
Exactly. Sending a signal back down to the muscles, the frontline surgeons, telling them exactly how to adapt their technique to survive the threat.
That is a highly accurate physiological representation. The feedback loop is constant, iterative, and incredibly fast.
But looking at the sheer scale of this, 6 functional branches, over 200 proposed solutions, deep integration with DH combat support, the Armed Services Blood Program, public health,
Medical logistics, DHA medical affairs.
yeah, strategy and plans, information operations. It is a massive, sprawling bureaucracy.
It is.
So for a trauma surgeon deployed on the ground, used to making split-second decisions, does this top-down policy approach actually translate to faster, better patient care, or does it risk bogging down clinical agility with endless administrative red tape?
It is a highly valid concern for any attending surgeon who is used to the ultimate autonomy of their own operating room. But the data unequivocally shows that the exact opposite happens.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
The bureaucracy isn't there to dictate how you physically throw a stitch or tie a vessel. It is there to ensure you have the necessary units of whole blood, the fully trained deployable team, and the specific rotary wing evacuation platform ready and waiting when you need to tie that vessel.
Oh, I see.
By standardizing the TCCC courses across the entire military enterprise, the GTS actually frees the frontline provider. They can act decisively in the chaos, knowing with absolute certainty that the entire logistical system behind them is synchronized to support their clinical decisions.
That perfectly sets up our next step. We have built the administrative framework, this massive nervous system. Now let's follow a critically injured casualty through the actual physical architecture of this battlefield trauma system.
The operational pathway, roles 1 through 4.
Yes, and I want to make sure we tailor this specifically for the civilian surgeon listening so they understand exactly how this translates to their world.
Well, the JTS, much like any high-functioning health system, has a singular, unwavering focus: the patient. But what makes the JTS unique is how that focus is applied across an incredibly hostile, austere, and geographically dispersed operational framework. The care always begins at role 1, which is the immediate point of injury.
And let's be extremely clear here, Role 1 pre-hospital care is nothing like civilian EMS.
Not at all.
In the civilian sector, paramedics generally wait for police to secure a scene before they enter. They arrive in a well-lit ambulance with an array of monitors and medications.
In the combat environment, role 1 care is often delivered under active hostile fire, in total darkness, in the dirt, in extreme temperature fluctuations.
Every single service member on that patrol is a potential medical provider.
Initial care is delivered through self-aid, buddy care, or a highly trained combat medic following strict tactical combat casualty care or TCCCC guidelines.
This could be as simple as a soldier applying a high and tight limb tourniquet to themselves while actively returning fire.
Or as complex as a medic managing a destroyed airway, achieving aggressive junctional hemorrhage control, and even performing a needle decompression or a tube thoracostomy for a tension pneumothorax right there in the dirt.
Under fire.
Right. The goal is sheer immediate survival. Once stabilized at the point of injury, the patient must be rapidly moved. They're transported to a higher echelon of care, typically Role 2.
And Role 2 represents forward resuscitative care. For the attending surgeons listening, think of Role 2 as a highly mobile, incredibly austere damage control surgery capability pushed as far forward into the battle space as physically possible.
It might be a temper tent, or a weathered concrete building reinforced with sandbags, just like the photos in the text illustrate.
You are doing rapid exploratory laparotomies, packing shattered livers, placing temporary intravascular shunts in blown-out femoral arteries, and gaining gross hemostasis.
You are absolutely not doing complex definitive bowel anastomosis or vascular reconstruction here. You are strictly buying time.
Because the physiology won't support a long operation.
Exactly. Role 2 ensures the patient survives the subsequent flight to Role 3. Role 3 is the in-theater hospital.
And this facility has a much more robust surgical and inpatient footprint. You have more operating tables, significant holding capacity, dedicated ICU beds, advanced imaging like CT scanners.
And a broader array of surgical subspecialties available.
And if they require more than the theater can provide, we reach Role 4.
Right. Role 4 facilities are permanently located outside the combat zone, typically large military medical treatment facilities within the continental United States, or CONUS, and sometimes major OCONUS bases like Landstuhl in Germany.
These are your standard, fully equipped, ACS-verified trauma centers.
They provide the definitive surgical care, the complex maxillofacial and orthopedic reconstruction, advanced neurosurgery, specialized burn care, and long-term comprehensive rehabilitation.
We have this geographic spread from Role 1 through Role 4, but the connective tissue between these roles is what the text refers to as en route care.
And this is where the global logistics become truly mind-bending. Patient movement can be accomplished by ground ambulances, rotary wing helicopters, or massive fixed-wing transport aircraft.
The specific platform chosen depends on the patient's clinical acuity, the current tactical threat environment, and the overarching mission requirements.
And the fundamental goal of en route care is critical to understand. It is to flawlessly continue the exact level of care initiated at the sending facility without any degradation in the patient's physiology as they progress through the system.
The text specifically highlights the critical care air transport teams, the CCAT-Ts. The media often refers to them as flying ICUs.
They do.
Let's break down this capability for a critical care fellow who might be listening. A CCAT can provide true intensive care unit-level care for up to 3 fully ventilated patients, or up to 5 in expanded contingency scenarios, while flying across the ocean in the back of a military transport plane like a C-17.
Just think about the immense physiological challenges of that environment. You are actively managing severe, acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, massive transfusion protocols, elevated intracranial pressure from traumatic brain injuries, and open, packed abdomens, all at high altitude.
You are dealing with Boyle's law and barometric pressure changes, expanding trapped gas in the body, relentless vibration, extreme ambient temperature fluctuations.
And incredibly limited physical space to maneuver around the stretcher. It is an extraordinary feat of critical care medicine.
And the clinical impact of seamlessly linking these roles. The text notes that a severely injured combat casualty, someone who has stepped on an IED, can be stabilized on a battlefield by a medic, undergo damage control surgery in a tent by a forward surgical team at Role 2, be stabilized at a Role 3 hospital, loaded onto a flying ICU with a CCAT, and arrive at a Role 4 ACS-verified definitive care facility in the United States, all within 72 hours of the initial blast.
It is an unparalleled feat of global medical logistics. There is simply nothing else like it in the world.
Watching a critically injured patient move through these sequential roles is basically like watching a baton in a high-stakes relay race.
But the baton is the patient's remaining physiologic reserve.
Right. The goal of en route care isn't just to physically transport the baton from point A to point B. It is to strictly prevent any physiological degradation, to ensure you don't drop a single drop of that precious reserve while passing it from the combat medic to the forward surgeon to the CSAT intensivist and finally to the Role 4 trauma team.
That is exactly the mandate. Absolute physiological stability during transport.
Wait, hold on a second. If we look at our civilian systems, we constantly push for direct transport to the highest possible level of care.
Sure.
We literally tell EMS to bypass the local, perfectly capable community hospital and bring that major blunt trauma directly to our level 1 or level 2 center. So does rigidly staging patients sequentially through roles 1, 2, and 3 on the battlefield actually delay definitive hemostasis and reconstruction? Why not just fly them straight to role 3?
That is a phenomenal clinical question, and it perfectly highlights the stark difference between civilian geography and military operational geography.
Okay.
In a major metropolitan city, your transport time to a level I trauma center might be 15 minutes by ground or air. The patient can physiologically survive that brief transport.
Sure.
In a theater of war, the Role 3 or Role 4 facility might be a 3-hour flight away, traversing hostile airspace. If a patient with a shattered pelvis and a transected femoral artery bypasses a Role 2 forward surgical team to fly directly to Role 3, they will simply bleed to death in the back of the helicopter.
The physiological reserve runs out before they arrive.
Exactly. Staging a patient through Role 2 isn't an arbitrary delay of definitive care. It is the absolute physiological prerequisite for the patient surviving long enough to receive that definitive care later.
The Role 2 surgeon achieves temporary hemostasis, stops the enteric spillage from blown bowels, aggressively resuscitates with blood products, and makes the patient survivable for the subsequent long-haul flight.
Correct. The geography dictates the physiology.
That makes perfect sense. So the physical structure of Rules 1 through 4 provided the necessary environment for survival. But it is clear that the environment alone wasn't enough.
No, it wasn't.
It was the ruthless, continuous analysis of the data generated within those roles that led to the clinical breakthroughs that are now the absolute standard in U.S. trauma bays today. Let's dig deep into the clinical triumphs and performance improvement generated by the JTS.
The establishment of the DoD Trauma Registry allowed for massive, systemic combat mortality analyses that completely upended our historical understanding of trauma.
Let's look closely at the hemorrhage data because the statistical findings are absolutely staggering.
The largest, most comprehensive analysis of combat mortality showed that 87% of all combat mortalities occurred in the pre-hospital environment.
87%. So the vast majority of the battle for life is either won or lost before the patient ever sees a surgeon's scalpel.
And it gets more specific. Of those pre-hospital deaths, the data revealed that 91% of the potentially survivable deaths were directly due to hemorrhage.
91% of survivable deaths. That number is a profound clinical mandate. You cannot ignore data that loud.
You simply cannot. This singular discovery directly spurred the widespread mandatory issuance of tourniquets to all deploying service members.
Combined with the rigorous TCCC tenure to support immediate application for life-threatening extremity hemorrhage.
Real-time data analysis revealed casualties were bleeding to death from isolated limb wounds simply because they couldn't reach a medic in time. The rapid fielding of standard windlass tourniquets saved thousands of lives almost overnight.
But saving the patient wasn't just about stopping the bleeding externally. It was fundamentally about how we intelligently replace what was lost internally. Let's talk about damage control resuscitation, or DCR.
This is where military registry data completely revolutionized civilian trauma resuscitation protocols.
Absolutely. The text notes that this massive paradigm shift was sparked conceptually by a seminal commentary published in the Journal of Trauma.
Right. In-depth analysis of massive hemorrhage data showed that resuscitation relying almost exclusively on blood products, aggressively moving away from the historical standard of massive crystalloid infusion, was strongly associated with vastly improved survival rates.
We are talking about the critical shift to the 1.1.1 ratio. 1 unit of packed red blood cells, 1 unit of fresh frozen plasma, and 1 unit of platelets.
Yes. For decades, trauma bays pumped liters of cold, normal saline or lactated ringers into bleeding patients. The problem is that crystalloid has zero oxygen carrying capacity and zero clotting factors.
The goal of 1.1.1 was to replicate whole blood as closely as pharmacologically possible. You have to prevent the dilutional coagulopathy that occurs when you wash out the patient's remaining clotting factors with saline.
You have to fight the lethal triad of trauma: hypothermia, metabolic acidosis, and coagulopathy. Massive crystalloid resuscitation exacerbates all three.
It makes the patient colder.
It dilutes the factors.
And the ensuing poor perfusion worsens the acidosis, which in turn poisons the enzymatic reactions of the coagulation cascade.
And the military took this physiological logic a step further. They aggressively reincorporated actual, warm, fresh, whole blood into their resuscitation protocols.
And pushed these advanced DCR capabilities all the way to the pre-hospital environment, right to the point of injury with the medics.
Which is brilliant because whole blood provides a perfectly balanced, concentrated delivery of red cells, plasma, and platelets, all functioning at peak physiological capability without the extra anticoagulants and preservatives found in separated component therapy.
And because both pre-hospital and in-hospital deaths were so heavily attributed to hemorrhage, specifically truncal and junctional hemorrhage, where a standard limb tourniquet simply won't work, like a high groin or axillary bleed, they pushed heavily for advanced mechanical adjuncts.
We saw the rapid development of specialized junctional tourniquets. And critically, the military aggressively sponsored the research, development, and fielding of REBOA.
Resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta. Let's explain that for a moment. You are deploying a balloon catheter through the common femoral artery, advancing it up into the aorta, and inflating it to temporarily occlude all blood flow below the balloon.
It effectively acts as an internal tourniquet,
Supporting crucial perfusion to the heart and brain while instantly stopping massive truncal or pelvic bleeding. And the military was doing this in highly austere locations, with the eventual goal of pre-hospital use by special operations medics.
And what was the ultimate overarching result of the trauma system rigidly enforcing these guidelines, distributing tourniquets to everyone, shifting the paradigm to 1.1.1 and whole blood, and rapidly fielding adjuncts like REBOA?
What was the drop?
The case fatality rate dropped to less than 10% during the height of the Middle East conflicts. That is a historic, staggering medical achievement in the history of warfare.
It is unparalleled. For decades, relying on massive crystalloid infusions was like finally realizing you can't fix a ruptured oil line in an engine by pouring in gallons of cheap washer fluid.
It might fill the tank, but the engine will still seize.
You need oil. You need the clotting factors, the active platelets, the critical oxygen carrying capacity of hemoglobin.
That is exactly the physiological truth the data proved.
But let me challenge this translation for a second. Given that civilian trauma often involves blunt force, trauma-like high-speed motor vehicle collisions, falls from significant height, crush injuries, rather than the penetrating blast injuries and high-velocity gunshot wounds predominantly seen in military combat, how seamlessly do these military DCR and REBOA protocols actually map onto our civilian ACS guidelines? Are we fundamentally treating a different disease process?
That is a crucial question, and it's one the entire civilian surgical community debated heavily when this data first emerged. It is absolutely true that the primary mechanism of injury differs significantly.
Right.
However, the underlying pathophysiology of hemorrhagic shock and trauma-induced coagulopathy is remarkably conserved across mechanisms.
Meaning, whether your spleen is catastrophically shattered by a steering wheel in an MVC or ruptured by the overpressure of a blast wave, your body reacts the same way.
Yes, you are bleeding massively, you are rapidly consuming your clotting factors, your fibrinolysis goes into overdrive, and you are becoming profoundly acidotic. The military proved beyond a doubt that early, balanced hemostatic resuscitation, the 1.1.1 ratio or whole blood, saves lives, regardless of the initial mechanism of injury.
And civilian trauma systems rapidly adopted this because the core physiology holds true.
Exactly. REBOA, similarly, has proven highly effective for massive exsanguinating blunt pelvic fractures in civilian settings. The military data provided the robust proof of concept that civilian centers then adapted and refined for their specific patient populations.
So the translation is remarkably robust. Now, moving beyond our own borders, it is fascinating to see in the text that the Department of Defense isn't just optimizing its own internal trauma system.
No, they are actively leveraging these seasoned trauma experts to build capacity in allied, heavily resource-constrained nations.
This entire effort is known as Global Health Engagement, or GHE.
Yes. Per DoD Instruction 2000.30 and the 2018 National Defense Strategy, global health engagement isn't just a side project. It is a core mission.
It builds partner nation stability, it develops both their military and civilian medical capacity, it builds essential trust between governments, and ultimately supports U.S. national security objectives.
The DoD fundamentally wants clinical and logistical interoperability between U.S. and partner nation capabilities.
To accomplish this massive task, they deploy highly specialized teams of trauma system experts from the Uniformed Services University, or USU, in conjunction with the Center for Global Health Engagement.
These teams physically go into low and middle-income countries to comprehensively assess and help develop their geographical trauma systems.
And it is critical to note that this is not just a high-level administrative meeting in a capital city where they hand over a binder.
Oh, absolutely not. These assessments are incredibly rigorous and physically demanding. They utilize a specialized blend of standard World Health Organization surveys and highly specific military-relevant assessment tools.
Let's look at the granularity of some of these tools. They use the International Assessment of Capacity for Trauma to see if a medical center meets baseline minimum requirements.
They use the PIPE survey, which stands for Personnel, Infrastructure, Procedures, Equipment, and Supplies, to deeply assess gaps in resource-constrained facilities.
They rigorously assess anesthetic infrastructure, knowing that surgery is impossible without safe anesthesia.
And critically, the USU team deliberately augmented these standard WHO surveys with military-relevant data elements.
They aren't just looking at the ER, they're looking for expeditionary medical surgical capability, the availability of aeromedical evacuation capabilities like rotary and fixed wing assets.
The clinical knowledge and physical resources to provide true damage control trauma surgery and damage control neurosurgery.
And the daily use of current standard of care trauma adjuncts like tranexamic acid TXA and modern blood transfusion ratios.
The text describes their incredibly hands-on approach, and it is fascinating. These expert assessment teams physically walk through the local trauma bays. They check the physical layout for patient flow.
They literally count the number of sterile chest tubes on the shelf.
They check the IV bags of lactated ringers. They physically turn on the mechanoventilators and ask the local clinicians to demonstrate their competency in using them.
They check the expiration dates on essential resuscitation medications. And if permitted by the host nation, they actually scrub into the operating room to observe the surgical skills and decision-making of the local providers firsthand.
They evaluate the entire continuum of the system using the Global Trauma System Evaluation tool.
Looking at the strength of leadership, public injury prevention programs, patient access to care, the quality of initial care at rural district hospitals, long-term rehabilitation capabilities, and the presence of any quality improvement programs.
And then, crucially, they sit down with the host nation leadership to create a pragmatic plan that actually fits within their specific paradigm of affordability, maintainability, and sustainability.
You know, it reminds me of a corporate franchise audit, but with life or death consequences. You can't just drop a massive, fully verified ACS-level iTrauma Center protocol into a rural district hospital in a developing nation and expect it to work.
You have to thoroughly evaluate the local supply chain, the available personnel, the baseline training, and the electrical infrastructure first.
But this raises a significant concern. By using these military-relevant assessment tools, which explicitly prioritize things like advanced aeromedical evacuation and massive transfusion ratios, isn't there a massive risk of imposing Western, highly resourced paradigms on nations that might struggle just to maintain a basic supply of sterile chest tubes or clean running water?
That is the exact delicate tension the USU assessment teams have to navigate constantly. The text explicitly states that the core challenge is to creatively utilize the resources that these countries actually have to optimize trauma clinical care.
Right. They absolutely aren't there to mandate a multi-million-dollar CCAT program if the country doesn't even have a fleet of functional helicopters. They work to create short-term, highly achievable plans.
That might mean a solution as simple and inexpensive as establishing a dedicated radio communication line between rural emergency medical personnel and a receiving regional hospital, so the hospital actually knows a trauma patient is coming.
The ultimate goal is to build a highly functional system based squarely on their daily reality, not to replicate the incredibly expensive U.S. military system verbatim.
Adapt the core principles of the system, not necessarily the expensive hardware. That is vital. Now, the text makes a profound pivot. We see that just as the military is sharing its vast knowledge globally, it is actively urgently pushing to integrate its hard-won lessons domestically to save civilian lives right here at home.
This brings us to the monumental NASEM report, and what is essentially a moonshot for civilian trauma. This specific section of the text serves as a profound, almost disturbing wake-up call regarding a 50-year systemic funding failure in the United States. Let's look at the sheer, undeniable burden of disease.
The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention plainly reports that traumatic injury is the absolute leading cause of mortality for Americans aged 1 to 44.
These are the most economically and socially productive years of human life.
Yet, despite being the unquestionable leading cause of death for that massive, critical demographic, injury receives a disproportionately shockingly low percentage of National Institutes of Health funding.
Historically, the text notes, injury research receives less than 2 cents out of every federal dollar allocated for research on health problems.
And the tangible consequence of that gross underfunding is stark and measurable. Between the years 2000 and 2012, which happened to be the exact years the military was making historic, unprecedented strides in decreasing preventable death in Iraq and Afghanistan, the rate of death from injury in the United States actually increased faster than general population growth.
It is a staggering, unacceptable disconnect. The text lists 7 previous major national reports spanning a 50-year period, starting all the way back with the landmark 1966 report, Accidental Death and Disability, the neglected disease of modern society.
Every single one of these reports practically begged for coordinated federal funding and the creation of a National Institute of Trauma. And yet, there has been little to no substantial progress on that front.
Which is precisely why, in 2015, the Department of Defense contracted the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine NUSM to write a definitive blueprint for action.
The resulting 2016 report was boldly titled, A National Trauma Care System, Integrating Military and Civilian Trauma Systems to Achieve Zero Preventable Deaths After Injury.
The committee chair, Dr. Donald Berwick, set a remarkably clear and incredibly bold aim. 0 preventable deaths after injury and minimal disability for both combat casualties and every single American civilian.
To achieve this, the committee issued 11 major sweeping recommendations.
We absolutely need to highlight the core of those recommendations for the clinicians listening. They aggressively called for direct White House leadership to assign ultimate accountability for a national trauma care system.
They demanded that the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Health and Human Services work jointly, not in silos, to ensure military and civilian systems collect and share common data spanning the entire continuum of care.
They called for a mandated National Trauma Research Action Plan via presidential executive order.
They demanded that regulatory agencies fundamentally revise burdensome research regulations to accelerate clinical progress in trauma trials.
And crucially, they stated unequivocally that pre-hospital care must be recognized and funded as a seamless, essential component of healthcare delivery, not merely viewed as a basic transport mechanism to get the patient to the hospital door.
The overarching driving goal here is applying the Joint Trauma System's proven concept of focused empiricism directly to the civilian sector.
Focused empiricism simply means rapidly translating lessons learned from real-time data analysis directly into clinical care protocols, just like the military did with the tourniquet and whole blood.
The text argues passionately that we need this highly integrated capability not just for daily MVCs or gunshot wounds, but for major national security threats. Massive pandemics like COVID-19, catastrophic natural disasters, large-scale mass casualty incidents, and chemical or biologic events.
Because the text bluntly highlights that the current, highly fragmented, financially fragile, fiercely competitive private healthcare system in the U.S. struggles immensely during massive crises.
Mutual aid across regions proved incredibly challenging during the COVID-19 pandemic, simply due to the intense pressure for individual hospitals to hoard and maintain resources locally to stay financially solvent.
This is exactly why the NASEM report argues so strongly for a dedicated National Operations Center.
An operations center with absolute real-time situational awareness of available healthcare capacity across all geographic regions, strategically empowered and legally authorized to unilaterally redistribute personnel, critical resources, and patients during a large-scale national disaster.
You know, treating trauma and mass casualties like a strictly local, independent hospital problem during a massive national disaster, it's like trying to fight a raging forest fire with 100 different garden hoses that refuse to connect to each other instead of coordinating a massive systemic aerial drop.
You need the aerial view. You
Yeah.
need the absolute coordination.
But I have to challenge the core premise of the NASM report here: zero preventable deaths. Setting a goal of absolutely zero, is that simply a vital, necessary rallying cry meant to force systemic change? Or is it a statistical impossibility that sets the entire trauma system up for perceived failure, endless administrative reviews, and intense physician burnout?
It's an aspirational target deliberately designed to engineer a complete psychological paradigm shift within the medical community. Think about it this way. If you comfortably accept a baseline of 5% preventable mortality, you naturally stop looking for the hidden systemic flaws that cause that 5%.
You write it off as the cost of doing business in trauma.
By boldly setting the goal at absolute zero, every single preventable death triggers a rigorous, unavoidable root cause analysis. It forces continuous, uncomfortable learning.
The JTS achieved a case fatality rate of less than 10% in combat environments entirely by refusing to accept the bloody status quo.
The NASM report is explicitly challenging the civilian sector to adopt that exact same relentless, uncompromising intolerance for preventable mortality.
A relentless intolerance for preventable mortality. That is a truly powerful clinical framing.
Okay, this has been an incredibly dense and rich exploration of the text. Before we wrap up, I want to seamlessly transition to a quick synthesis segment. We need to translate these high-level battlefield pearls directly into actionable civilian practice for the surgeons listening right now. Let's do it.
Let's hit the three most common questions civilian surgeons ask when looking at this military framework. First, for the attending surgeon currently logging their cases, what is the most critical functional difference in utilizing data abstraction in the DoD registry compared to the standard civilian TQIP, the Trauma Quality Improvement Program?
The absolutely critical difference lies in the sheer speed of the feedback loop and the centralized authority to actually enforce clinical change.
Speed and authority.
Civilian TQIP is a phenomenal tool for long-term benchmarking. You get your risk-adjusted data back months later. You see exactly where you stand compared to similar level eye centers, and then your hospital's trauma committee slowly convenes to decide if they want to adopt new protocols over the next year.
The DoD registry operates on that concept of focused empiricism.
The data abstraction is nearly real-time. If the registry data analysts identify a sudden gap, for example, noting that prehospital hypothermia is independently increasing mortality on long flights, the JTS has the central military authority to immediately issue a system-wide clinical practice guideline mandating active warming on all evacuation platforms, and they can track compliance instantly.
The cycle from data abstraction to mandatory system-wide clinical application is compressed from years down to weeks or sometimes even days.
It's the combination of speed and absolute authority that is the fundamental difference.
Second question. The text discusses the Defense Health Agency strategy for expeditionary skill sustainment. How does that military concept translate to civilian surgeons keeping their own skills sharp for mass casualty events or rare penetrating trauma, especially if they work at a center that primarily sees routine, blunt MVCs?
Expeditionary skill sustainment recognizes the simple truth that highly specialized trauma skills atrophy quickly if not used regularly. For the military, this means formally embedding their active duty surgeons in high-volume, high-acuity civilian trauma centers in major cities between deployments to keep their hands moving.
For the civilian surgeon, the translation is aggressive cross-training and high-fidelity simulation.
If you are attending in a blunt, trauma-heavy center, you must actively pursue specialized simulation training for massive penetrating trauma, resuscitative thoracotomies in the bay, and complex vascular shunting.
It also means actively engaging with regional disaster drills, and I don't just mean the administrative tabletop exercises, but full-scale interagency mass casualty simulations that physically stress your triage pathways and drain your blood bank capacities to the absolute breaking point.
You must rigorously train for the catastrophic physiology you rarely see, so your hands know exactly what to do when it arrives in mass.
Train for the absolute worst, not just the everyday routine. Finally, the third question. The text mentions a harsh, undeniable financial reality. Civilian hospitals operate on incredibly tight margins, relying heavily on lucrative elective procedures to stay afloat. When COVID hit, the immediate cancellation of high-margin procedures devastated health system finances across the country. Based strictly on what the text discusses regarding a new financial model for crisis healthcare, how does the NASM report propose we actually build this required surge capacity without completely bankrupting these civilian medical centers?
The text is extremely clear on this point. The notion that private civilian hospitals will willingly operate below their maximum capacity, purposely leaving beds empty and staff idle to ensure readiness for a theoretical future crisis, is completely financially unrealistic.
The current fee-for-service model inherently punishes readiness.
Therefore, the text argues forcefully that a national trauma system must be deeply rooted in a brand new financial model that creates an actual business case for readiness.
While the text doesn't explicitly outline the specific legislative payout structure, it unequivocally asserts that massive financial tools at the federal level must be deployed to subsidize and actively incentivize hospitals to maintain excess bed capacity, robust equipment stockpiles, and fully trained reserve personnel.
Readiness must be funded continually as a critical national security asset, rather than being treated as a catastrophic loss of revenue for a private hospital.
Readiness funded as a national security asset. That is a profound shift in national perspective. Okay, it is time to wrap up this massive deep dive. Let's synthesize the core actionable takeaways for our listeners.
If we pull back and look at the entirety of this comprehensive text, the central, undeniable thesis is this. Trauma is not just a discrete surgical operation. It is a continuously learning, highly integrated geographical system.
The direct application for your clinical practice tomorrow morning is to embrace the JTS concept of focused empiricism. It means fiercely utilizing real-time registry data within your own hospital to adapt and refine your clinical guidelines constantly.
It means aggressively standardizing your massive transfusion protocols based on the military's proven 1.1.1 and whole blood evidence.
And it means stepping outside the comfortable four walls of your operating room to passionately advocate for seamless pre-hospital to rehab integration in your local and regional trauma networks.
You have to care just as much about the EMS triage protocols and the blood bank logistics as you care about the instruments neatly arranged on your Mayo stand.
You cannot just be a skilled surgeon, you have to become a system architect. Which brings me right back to where we started this conversation, the pristine, algorithmic, highly controlled trauma bay.
The text leaves us with a chilling but absolutely vital concept about the future landscape of trauma.
The National Health Security Strategy explicitly describes future threats. Unprecedented mass casualty events, novel pandemics, crippling cyber attacks on hospital infrastructure, and the massive potential for near-peer global conflicts involving directed energy weapons.
So I want to leave you, the clinicians on the front line, with this final provocative thought.
If a massive catastrophic event occurs on U.S. soil, a true national disaster, or a kinetic conflict, the traditional, highly structured military evacuation chain of roles 1 through 4 simply won't exist. There are no safe rear hospitals across the ocean to fly patients to. How will your civilian trauma system function when the homeland is the battlefield, and your pristine Level I trauma center suddenly, violently becomes an austere, entirely overwhelmed, Roll 2 forward surgical site?
Are you truly prepared to operate when the quicksand returns?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay relentless, and we will see you next time on The Critical Edge.